to talk about the civic engagement of healthcare interpreters on different levels from local to state to federal. We have our chair, Margarita Bekker, who is the moderator for today's webinar, and two presenters, Dr. Bill Rivers, Executive Director of the Joint National Committee for Languages, National Council for Languages and International Studies. He's joining us out of Washington, D.C. And Don Schinske, who many of you know as the Executive Director of the California Healthcare Interpreters Association, CHIA, but Don is also an Advocacy Director for Cal Capital Group. Both Don and Bill are professional lobbyists, so we definitely are very grateful that they're going to share their expertise with us today. With this, I'm going to give the floor to our moderator, Margarita.
Good morning, everybody. Well, at least it's still morning in California, where I am, and it's sunny. I am very grateful that Bill and Don are joining us today because the expertise they will share with us, I think, will help all of us. The idea of this webinar came to us several months ago. As some of you know, I used to be CHIA president, and now I'm a chair of CCHI, and we're often approached by trainers and interpreters who are having some sort of issues on a state or local level, and they ask us to intercede on their behalf. And there's definitely, while associations and certification bodies really do what they can to help, there's also a limit to what we can do because of our nonprofit statuses, because we're not on the ground, and certainly certain state agencies are not excited when a national organization tells them what to do. And while we want to help, and we certainly provide help as a support letters and sometimes personal appearances, we realize that sometimes there's misunderstanding of what can be done on the ground level. We've certainly seen the rise of grassroots movements, and we thought that this kind of webinar can provide healthcare interpreters and trainers with tools to advocate for themselves in their own states and smaller regions and everywhere else. It's kind of ironic that we're taught so well how to advocate for our patients, but we don't really have any sort of training on how to contact senators or congressmen, how to appear at the meetings, and what to do. So this is how this webinar came about. And also what inspired me, my own sort of very small local experience that I will share. So my experience kind of happened on the town level, and then Don will talk about state level, and Bill will talk about federal level, so it will be a nice progression. Next slide, please. So I bike to work, and 99% of my route is very safe, and it has bike lanes and signage, but about 1% of the route where I live has no bike lanes and had no signs. And every time I would bike on this particularly busy road, which had on and off ramp, I would feel like that bicyclist. I really wanted to be above the traffic somewhere on the electrical wires, because quite often I was harassed by drivers who would scream at me, bikes belong in a bike lane, and of course there was no bike lane, and it kept going on for months and months, and I realized that I'm not safe when I bike on the street. There's no other way because of the train tracks, and I'm not the only one who's using this road. My son and his friends, many people who work in my institution live in my town, and we all bike on this extremely unsafe street. And when I was sort of asking people, is there anything been done, there was this sort of air of, well, we don't think anything can be done. It's a very busy street, and we just going to be that way on that busy street, hoping no car will hit us. Next slide, please. And so what was happening, I realized that something needs to be done. And I started contacting various places, mayors of my own town. I emailed the city hall, and what I realized right away, that I was really wasting my time. I didn't know who to contact at first. I was totally lost in a maze of local governments and agencies. There were things like transportation committees who were sending me to public work, and then eventually some kind person emailed me from the office of mayor in my town and said, you know, I know you live next to that street, but the street does not belong to our town. That street, that particular part of the street, of that road, belongs to the next town, and the segment after belongs to even another town. And I realized that I really wasted lots of time, my time and other time, officials' times, emailing them, and I should have researched before I started sending emails. I should have realized what is this area, who it belongs to, and what are the different committees. It really would have taken me maybe 15-20 minutes doing this research on a local government websites, and I would have contacted the right person much faster than I did. Next slide, please. So what happened is that after I contacted the right person, sort of a right person at the next town, they informed me that this town, in fact, has a bicyclist and public transportation committee. And they connected me to them, and the bicyclist and public transportation committee connected me to the local bicyclist safety association or organization we have in the area. And after I emailed all of them, those local stakeholders explained to me what was going on, and they said that the local government has been sort of very slowly working on the question of safety on the street, but because they never really heard from too many people, they weren't really motivated. And we developed a plan of action. And what was, you know, it was good to talk to people who were actually experts in this, in the bicyclist safety and public transportation and road planning. I actually also had contact with the local road engineers, and a plan of action was sort of established. So the first idea is to speed up installation of the bike signs, because it has been in the work, and I learned a lot about the process. Apparently the process is, first you put the signs that indicate to the drivers that bicyclists are allowed full use of the road, and that provides a certain amount of safety, and that signals to the drivers that this is shared road. And ideally you want to have a bike lane, but I learned a lot about budgets, what costs how much and how long it takes to install things. One of the things I suggested is that I invest some time and appear at the local city hall meeting, the councilman meeting, and testify about the situation to the mayor and the entire committee. And of course the whole idea was that we compromise, that it's not possible to install bike lanes right away, but that at the beginning we should press for the signs. So I learned from my experience, and I prepared myself for the city council meeting. I learned who I emailed to put myself on the agenda, that they do in fact have free period when people can't speak. I learned how much time I have, when it happens. I arranged, it actually was great. It would happen in the evening at 7 p.m. so I didn't have to take time off. I prepared my little speech, and I did research about those signage and lanes and what happened in towns and cities near me. We actually had several disturbing incidents in 2 towns near my town where bicyclists unfortunately died or were gravely injured. So my 5-minute speech was about safety, and what I told the mayors and the committee is that we should strive to be a town on the peninsula that puts in signs and bicycle lanes before something bad happens, before somebody dies. Because it seemed a common theme in towns around me is that bad things happen and then suddenly there are safety improvements. And mayor really listened, and so other members of the council, people were writing down what I was discussing and what I was saying. So what we have now, like within 2 weeks, we had those signs, several of them. Bicyclists may use full lane, and that's what we have now. And it was quite magical. After they installed the signs, I noticed that cars now move 3 feet away from me and other bicyclists. No one harasses us. No one screams, go to your bike lane or go to another street. There is a clear understanding that it is shared lane. And the signs they installed are bigger than regular signs because there's more traffic and there's a huge signs. And what we're working on now in the future is actual bike lanes. And now I understand how complex the process is, that it's not sort of that simple, just paint them and things work out, that there a study needs to be done, a traffic impact study and so on. But this is what they're working on, and the hope is that within the year we'll have a bike lane. So that was my local experience, and what I learned from this experience is that important to do your homework before you even start contacting people, and don't despair. It takes time. So now I would like to pass the baton to Don Schinske, who will teach us how to engage with people on the state level.
And I think Don is still muted, but he's going to...
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Margarita. I trust everyone can hear me okay.
Yes.
Margarita, in listening to your presentation, it struck me how similar it is to lobbying at the state and again at the federal level. There are added layers of complexity, and certainly multiply the number of people and organizations involved by a certain factor. But basically the steps and the way to think about it seems to apply. Kind of in thinking about how I was going to talk about the process today, it seemed to me, to speak to people who don't ordinarily do advocacy or lobbying as part of their occupation, that two questions really need to be answered, which is it really worth the trouble? That is, you all have day jobs. There's not the opportunity to spend long stretches of time in your respective state capitals or in Washington or even at City Hall. And so one fundamental barrier I think that has to be crossed is to do that analysis and to understand where you can be effective and be strategic and able to leverage the time and the knowledge and the passion that you do have to affect positive change. I think the discussion always has to start out, though, with some basic acknowledgement of how daunting the task might look, particularly when you think of a place like California, where standing alone, both geographically in terms of population, it would be one of the world's biggest countries. As it is, it's the most populous state. We have probably the most involved full-time legislature, the biggest state apparatus. And for someone who's approaching it, particularly as an individual, it's a miracle that even people convince themselves sometimes to kind of dive in and see what they can do. I think for our particular area, our particular policy area of language assistance in healthcare or language access, you'll always want to think about, well, what's already there? That is, how can I find out what is our current policy in the state of California? And to do that, you have to understand that no one sat down 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago and say, well, let's do a comprehensive policy around language access in California. The fact of the matter, as you probably all know, is that policy evolves in bits and pieces and fits and starts, and it's never available or reviewable or learnable all from one location. You'll see on the screen I pulled a three kind of significant bills that passed in California over the last decade and a half. It's just not so much for you all to understand the particulars of them, but just to realize how daunting the task is of maybe going out and finding out what even is existing policy. You'll see that we had a bill last year to put up a pilot program to study and put together a pilot program around how you would actually pay for language assistance in our Medi-Cal program. One of the grails in policymaking in this area in California has been to figure out a way to incorporate some sort of billing mechanism in our state Medicaid program for language services. It seems to me that the issue has been worked on now for the better part of 2 decades. Now the task here is to come up with some pilot programs. But you'll see here the point of the slide is that all these bits and pieces of policy live in different places, which is to say, on this particular piece of legislation, we have these big books in California, and every other state will have the same, which are our codes, our statutes, all live in these various books. This part of it that was passed in this bill is parked in the Welfare and Institutions Code. We had a significant piece of workers' comp legislation a few years back that dealt with interpreting services in work comp, amongst several other things. All work comp legislation exists in the state labor code. Decade or so back, we had a SB 853, which talked about what language assistance would look like within commercial health plans, and that got parked in both the health and safety code and the insurance code in California. Point being is there's no one place to go to figure out exactly what the state has on the books. It's a dog's breakfast of times and locations and places which all together can be stitched together, and you'd call that our state policy. Now, how does the law change? How does policy evolve? This is what I pulled this up mostly for the humor of it, but this is something that the state assembly puts out to hopefully enlighten people as to how the process works. I looked at this and I said that seems like that could only be put out by some sort of committee or another, because I found this all profoundly unhelpful, which is to say this doesn't give you a place to stop and start and figuring out where a citizen can inject themselves in any meaningful way into the process. Not surprisingly, in an effort to explain how the process works, in this case, it seems that the government has only made it more confusing. Furthermore, once you get past the passing of laws, there's a whole nother process that takes place, largely within the bureaucracy. A law is simply what the policy should be for maybe an altitude of 1,000 feet, but it remains for the bureaucracy, the various state agencies of government, to figure out what the actual operating instructions are. One way to think about it is there might be a law that's passed that says you have to put up a sign in the waiting room as to the availability of interpretation services for all the patients to see when they come in. And that will be what the law says. It will remain for the bureaucracy to figure out what that should actually look like, what should actually be contained on the sign, what languages the sign should be in the first place, even what the font size might be, and those types of details will tend to get worked out in the rulemaking process. I just threw these particular agencies out there because healthcare language assistance and healthcare interpreting policy it can touch on any one of these agencies, all of which have a piece of it in their domain. So again, another level of complexity, another barrier, in fact, to kind of getting started and figuring out what you're doing. Furthermore, since every webinar should probably have a few factoids in it, this is kind of my page of factoids. But the message here is, there is a industry in Sacramento that's devoted to working on and changing policy. Looks like, to me, add that up, $1 billion got spent last year, both electing people to the legislature by and another and then changing, trying to get those people you do elect to see the world your way in direct lobbying expenses. There's 1,800 registered lobbyists now in California, and all told, there's 120 different legislators. That's a lot of people to reach, but it presents a different challenge as well, is that each one of those legislators and their offices are awfully busy. When you think about it, there's 40 state senators in California. Each one of those state senators represents about 1 million people. So one way to think about it, that's a larger constituency than even members of the U.S. Congress have. Just by way of comparison. So there's that problem. There's just there's a crowd of people trying to do this activity of lobbying and advocacy. There's people who do it professionally. There's a lot of bills in play. There's about 5,000 that were in the last legislative session. In California, we have a 2-year legislative session. This year marks the start of another 2-year legislation. And overall, kind of the overriding picture one gets when you first start to wade in is that it's, of course, overly complicated. There's this deep suspicion that at least parts of it are fixed, and certainly the odds are stacked against you as an individual citizen setting out, trying to step in and make a difference. And of course, here might be your overriding feeling before you even get started. Why bother? Got a lot of things different to do. Why bother with advocacy? Well, I just singled out a couple of things here. Second one is actually fairly important. When I say that there's a lot of activity in the Capitol, there's a lot of professionals who do this full time. In this particular area of policy making, you will find that there are not 50 other people doing it. There are organizations who have a little slice of it that they try to do. As Natalia and Margarita have explained, a lot of the healthcare interpreting organizations, certainly like ours, are not necessarily organized under the law to do a lot of advocacy. CHIA itself is a 501c3 public charity. We exist primarily for educational purposes, and we can advocate, but only a certain amount directly. There are other organizations in California that are more directly involved in advocacy. I think offhand in this area of policymaking, there's basic patient access to healthcare type organizations such as Health Access and Western Center on Law and Poverty, who are interested in language assistance. There's an organization called the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network, which is outstanding in terms of advocacy in the area of policy making. But they, none of those organizations are particularly advocating. If you are a healthcare interpreter on this webinar, and I assume most of you people are, you have your own unique set of interests, while a lot of these other organizations are organized and charged with their primary interest is health equity and health services provided to patients and health outcomes for patients, which is to say their perspective is focused, rightly so, on the patients, and whereas healthcare interpreters, where those interests overlie a lot of the time, they're not 100% identical, and healthcare interpreters have their own issues. And so this is one area of policy making in California where I would say there's an opportunity to lead, simply because there's no one really active in it around the clock, and and those that are active in this area of policy making just divide their time on a whole range of issues. And as I say, it's important. Obviously, a lot of you come at your work with a good deal of dedication and passion and history. You may have become an interpreter to serve a community that you grew up in. Certainly you are going to be more interested in your profession than in the future of your profession and the environment in which you practice than probably anybody else. And of course, in the end, at the end, there's the patient who always deserves the best that you have and the best that the system can offer it. And at the end, I would concur with Margarita. That is, it works. Sometimes it isn't pretty. Sometimes it just sort of barely works. Sometimes it leaves you wanting more. But if you squint right, I can make the case that even as a citizen advocate, doing it part of the time, you can have an impact that justifies the effort. How do you get started? Well, I'm not going to go through this, but there's various ways you hear about things. Typically, the input I get, the questions I get from our members in CHIA has to do with the fact that they heard something cooking, they've heard that there's a bill coming to pass, they've had a set of regulations that were approved, and they don't like them, and they wanted to know how they can change things. They've heard about it from their peers, they heard something on public radio, they read a little something in the newspaper, their employer mentioned something, they belong to another organization that's tracking it. Generally speaking, there's some thread that catches your attention, and the first order of business is always research it. Anything you hear by definition is going to be incomplete. Chances are these days, particularly in our kind of culture and media climate, anything you hear about is always going to come from a single point of view, when in fact the issue is generally more complicated and has more sides to it than is generally allowed for in most communications that come across certain, social media certainly, but also in traditional media as well. So use the internet. It is your friend. That is where you can always dig down and research a particular bill, policy. The more you do, the smarter you'll get. Certain names will start popping up. You'll get a list of people that you figure that you should talk to, but always do your research. As Margarita says, you want to do what you can before you engage, so you don't waste a lot of time figuring out stuff that you could have figured out ahead of time. Now, the actual mechanics of advocacy in California, I've cooked down to something. My point here is not to say, well, you know all this and then you'll know how to lobby and everything you need to know. I think my point is primarily to show you that it's all pretty learnable. There's no great barrier to entry on the knowledge front to do advocacy in California. There are some basic steps in the process that you should be aware of, and appreciate that, well, there's plenty of places to go to learn more about specifically what needs doing when. Just like California is like every other state on some level. Bills get introduced at some point in the legislative process, generally early on. Bills go through a policy committee. They go through a fiscal committee where they talk about the bill's economic implications or its impact on the state government. It goes out to the floor of either the Assembly or the Senate, depending on where it was introduced. And then it goes over to the next chamber, goes through the same process, and if it emerges from that, it goes to the governor's desk, whereupon a lot of bills are followed by a round of bureaucratic rulemaking, also known as the regulatory process. Bills can be amended at each step within the legislature. They can be lobbied by anyone at any of the steps, including when they get to the governor's office. California, there's two basic places to go, and this is analogous to what will be available in any other state. We have an excellent state website that is searchable, has just about everything you need to know on it. Well, if you dig around in there, you figure out how to get there. You can search for bills, you can search for areas of code. If I say, well, I want to look up interpreter, and see what bills have interpreter in them, it should give me a list. And there's where they contain in particular bills. I'm looking at bills for this year. Aha, here's a bill from Senator Tony Atkins down in San Diego dealing with the qualifications for interpreters and notification of enrollees in health plans, insurance plans, and interpreted how many languages that interpretation and language assistant has to be provided in, which say this looks like to me a further refinement of some of the requirements that are now in the books. And for me, this looks like an interesting bill that pertains directly to us. And like with most state sites, it'll have a if you're here, you'll see that there'll be some place to check on where the bill is in the process. I won't go through all that, but you'll have analyses that are prepared by each of the committees that it goes through. And so, for instance, on this particular bill, it'll have analysis from the floor, talks about, and there's the sponsor, the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network, which is an excellent organization, and talks about specifically what the bill does. It looks like a good bill. If it's a bill that you say, yeah, I think that's a great bill, and I would like to support that, you can find out, it looks like it got off the Senate floor, it's going to go over to the Assembly. You can determine that it will get assigned to a committee in the Assembly, most likely the Assembly Health Committee. Well, how do I advocate the Assembly Health Committee? Well, we have another place to go in California. It's called the Daily File. It gets published every single day, or updated every single day, maybe should be the best way to describe it. Here's today's version from May 31st. Has everything you need to know, legislative calendar for the year. Here's standing committees of the Assembly. If I look at this and I want to say, who do I need to get in touch with on the Health Committee? Well, there's the Health Committee. The chair is Jim Wood. Looks like a big committee with a lot of members on it. Ultimately, to send in a letter that says, dear Health Committee, I would like you to vote yes on this bill when it comes up for hearing. You can, send a letter via fax, or a lot of emailing happens these days. You send it to the committee consultant, and it will get entered into that analysis that the committee looks at to vote. So, in a way, just a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, a little bit of understanding that all the information you need is in fact publicly available. It does require a little bit of investment in time and persistence to kind of sort through it. Once you have done that, though, you will have you'll be a leg up. That is, you will be past the point of which you don't feel like there's anything you do. You'll know that there's something that you can do. Well, what are those things? One, you obviously want to research all you can, as I say, but you can contact organizations that you know of that might have similar or related agendas, might have an interest in that bill, and see what they're doing on that bill. And if they're not doing anything, maybe they have decided, hey, it isn't much of a priority. Maybe they've decided, maybe they don't know about it. Maybe they're waiting for someone to be interested. But point being is you should find out what everybody else is doing on the bill, if anything. If you belong to organizations, you say, hey, I belong to CHIA. CHIA, why don't you get in a letter on the bill? Why don't you go testify in committee? We may say no for a variety of reasons, but the point being is you're a member of an organization, and as always in lobbying, if you can find somebody else to do your work for you, great. But also, if you can work under the auspices of an organization, you can be that much more effective because you come in with an implied group constituency with you. It's just not just you alone as an individual. You can, if no such organization exists that's interested, why don't you drum up support from some of your peers and say, we are the United Interpreters of Encino, and suddenly you're a little organization. You can get together and you can write a letter and and do advocacy that way. That is, enlist like-minded people to your cause. At that point, you can call and write your legislators. You can do that either at their capital offices or at their district offices. Importantly, that you can actually call as a citizen. It's important that you be a constituent, I think, of that legislator. It's not entirely essential, but essentially a legislator will want to meet with you if you are a voter in their district far more than if you live in some other district. And you can meet with them in the district. In California, those days are typically Thursdays and Fridays, Fridays for certain, because those are the days they are not in Sacramento, but they're in the district. And timing is important too, as Margarita suggested. That is, a bill is not always of equal interest to a legislator at any point in the calendar. If they are on the health committee and the bill has been assigned to the health committee, there's generally a window of 2 or 3 weeks at which they are interested in hearing what people say about the bill. They are less interested after they voted on it. They are not interested necessarily if the bill isn't going to come to a committee that they are on. And so the timing becomes key, and that requires a little bit of drilling down and looking at the calendar and seeing where the bills are in the process. Again, if you can work with other organizations that can help with that, if you can, in the course of your efforts, meet people who are a little knowledgeable and steal 5 and 10 minutes of their time to get pointed in the right direction, those are always helpful too. You can do one if you're in Sacramento and want to advocate. Great thing to do. I think it's worthwhile. Whether you are successful or not, to my mind, is kind of less important maybe the first few times at it than actually figuring out, knowing your way around and realizing that, hey, just like anything else, there's a knowable set of techniques and mechanics that you can actually learn, and a set of competencies, as you were, just like any other occupation. You can meet with your advocacy organizations that you've contacted with it already and have a quick chat. You can meet legislators in the Capitol. You can just drop in on legislative offices. People from DC who sometimes come to the Capitol in Sacramento are astounded by how easy it is just to walk in and get a meeting with people, maybe not with the legislator, but maybe with their legislative director or somebody else in the office. But it really is open. You can go walk to and from wherever you want within the Capitol. Some other people you might want to set up an appointment with. Each of the committees that a bill goes through will have its own set of staff, and they are tasked with kind of analyzing and writing up analysis of each of the bills. It's generally, those are people you want to talk to because they are the ones who actually do have to learn all the sides of an issue and be able to write it up and present it to members. And so they tend to be very interested in what all the parties have to think about a bill. Caucus has to do with, sometimes the parties, Republican and Democrats, their caucus will make recommendations about particular bills. You could also become part of the theater that is testifying in committees. Committees have hearings. They hear a list of bills. You can go up and take the microphone just like you'd see on the news and say your bit. Legislative meetings are kind of their own animal, and you should sort of know some, I won't go through these, but there's some basics that you should be aware of if you go in this direction. They're generally brief. They're generally not with the legislator themselves. It's with somebody in the office. Sometimes you are meeting with a 22-year-old intern. One should never be put off by that. That's it's not personal, but generally the staffs are trying to do a lot of different things at the same time, and on a certain level you sometimes get what you get. Generally speaking, as I say, it's got to be brief. You want to make sure you have some good, solid leave behind materials that whoever you're meeting with can pass around the office or to the member. You always want to establish a follow-up item. That is, can I check back with you in a week to see where the member is on this? And then, of course, you want to obviously, I don't have to tell interpreters this, but body language is key. At a certain point in a meeting, it'll be clear when the person you're meeting with has another engagement to get to. They'll check their watch and get antsy, and then you're done. Just be sensitive to that, because chances are you won't be able to get your full bid in, and you won't be able to meet for an endless period of time. So with that, here's just some few do's and don'ts I put together about testifying in committee. Again, I don't expect people to memorize these. I just more or less wanted to break it down to show that each and of themselves, all the techniques involved are knowable. They're not hard to figure out. Sometimes you just need someone to explain a little bit to you. And this is kind of the basics of testifying in committee. I recommend everybody try it at some point in their advocacy career. It actually is a lot of fun, and it is a major part of the public show of the process. And you wind up getting through that process. You wind up meeting a lot of people and making yourselves visible to a lot more people at once than you would otherwise. Just a bit about the regulatory process before I wrap up here. This is the process, as I say, that happens after a bill has been signed. Typically, there's a period of months, sometimes years, that the bureaucracy has to go through to sort through how to implement a piece of legislation. To find out about how that works, probably the best piece of advice I have here is to go ahead and get yourself signed up on the mailing list, the emailing list. All the agencies have one. Here I've done the one for the Department of Healthcare Services. There's instructions here, as you see, to sign up for their listserv. Literally 99.9% of the communication you'll get from the agencies will have nothing to do with your topic, and so feel free to trash them. But if you are looking for a specific rulemaking process for a specific piece of legislation, that's a good place to track it. On certain pieces of rulemaking, there can be informal work groups that are convened ahead of time before regulations are built. If you have stepped forth and been a leader and you've been known element in the legislative process on a particular piece of legislation, oftentimes you will get enlisted to be part of the work group. They will find you, as I say at the bottom here, if you have stepped forward and identified yourself as a straight shooter and a reliable, knowledgeable spokesperson on an issue. They will fold you into the rulemaking process. Here is a little bit of rulemaking just as an example. This is around the SB 853 from a few years back. Through that process, and CHIA did take part in the informal work groups and then the formal regulatory process. In the end, we were part of a step forward, I guess you'd call it, in terms of ensuring that interpretation services that were provided by commercial health plans were of higher quality than they had been before. You'll see here there's some basic kind of bilingual proficiency and knowledge requirements. Obviously, as with any piece of policy making, it only gets you part of the way. That is, this is what the qualifications were for an interpreter that were at the time. We look at all these things over the long term as a step to where we would really like to go, which in California would be I would say for CHIA would be kind of a certification requirement that exists across all public and private health insurance programs. We would like there to be a true reimbursement mechanism within healthcare programs, so it can be identified as a an actual financial obligation that always gets paid for. We think the result of those things, reimbursement and certification, will ultimately be not just a stronger profession, but higher quality services for patients. Always take the long view. That is, once you get involved with advocacy, you should always play to win, but understand some of these things take time, and there's a cumulative effect. And there's Fidel Castro, who obviously took the long view and played to win at the same time. Final thought. Here's just some final thoughts. Process isn't as linear as it seems sometimes, which is to say the point is to keep knocking on doors, and sometimes success will come in places you least expect it and when you least expect it. But the point is to be ready. That is, have ideas out there, be known to have ideas out there, be known to have things that you want out there or things that you don't want. And sometimes windows of opportunity open at strange and interesting times. And so it's never about simply just the current transaction you're work on. You will always hear that there's never any money to do what you want to do. I would not let that deter you, because again, it's not personal. It's all just a question of priorities. Of course, there's never enough money. Also, always be aware it's very hard to pass bills. It's much easier to change bills. It's much easier to have bills stalled or killed. It requires a lot of resources and energy and time to pass bills. Remember, you'll see if you get involved with this and get a taste for it and like the process, you'll be dealing with everybody again. So always remember, what the basic rules of good business decorum are. And as I say, you'll succeed just enough to make it worthwhile. And it's kind of important too, kind of the third from last point. You are getting your feet wet and getting your hands dirty in the process. You may or may not change how you think about government and how it operates, but you will meet a lot. It will surprise you how many people you meet that are in it and went into government service for the right reasons and are still alive with the passion that brought them there in the first place. And you will find an awful lot of people that are worth knowing. So with that, I will pass it back to Margarita.
Thank you, Don. I really wish that I attended this webinar before I did my little advocacy for bike lanes. It would have gone so much easier. And now I'm passing baton to Bill Rivers. Thank you again for joining us from Washington, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say today.
Well, thank you, and I'm very very happy to present today, and want to make sure everyone can see my screen before we continue.
Yes.
Okay, great. And I really enjoyed Don's webinar, and I enjoyed Margarita's presentation at the beginning. The fundamentals of advocacy are they're really the same regardless of the level you're at. The details, of course, the devil's in the details. And I want to talk a little bit about the federal level, but I also want to just pick up on a couple of points that both Margarita and Don made. If we don't advocate on our own behalf, nobody's going to do it for us. And I think one of the persistent challenges in the language enterprise, broadly speaking, whether we're talking about interpreting, translation, education, and whatever part of it we're in, is there has been a tendency over the last 25 or 40 years to say, well, somebody's going to come along and make things better for us, and that never happens, right? And or that there's going to be some magic bullet that once and for always convinces the larger public, the legislators, the hospitals of the rightness of our cause. And I will have to say, and those of you who know me longer, that it took me maybe 20 years to figure out that there is no magic bullet, and that we always have to be present. We always have to be involved in advocacy. And as I said, if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it for us. I want to talk a little bit today about some of the key issues at the federal level. Some of this may be a review for folks on the call. The foundations of language access, And then very importantly, what we see in terms of directions in the current climate for language access at the federal level. And then I'd like to turn to the larger context. I hinted at this with the language enterprise, but healthcare interpreting in that larger context. The Commission on Language Learning of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and then the very large social and economic forces such as the potential repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act and some of the other things that we're seeing in the political landscape today. We have to be prepared for that landscape. We have to be realistic about the political landscape, but I don't think we have to be afraid of it or avoid it. And then what you can do at the national level to stay informed and to be engaged. So just a first introduction at first. I come from Washington, and so I'm fluent in acronym, highly proficient in acronym, probably a 3+ superior high acronym. The Joint National Committee for Languages and the National Council for Languages and International Studies are two related nonprofit organizations. The Joint National Committee is a 501c3, a charitable educational organization, originally founded in 1974 as an informal committee by a large number of language learning associations in order to coordinate advocacy at the federal level. Before that, there had been occasional efforts by one or another organization to influence federal policy with regard to languages, but they were fairly disjointed. In 1981, as the outcome of one of the recommendations of the President's Commission on Languages and International Studies, sometimes called the Carter Commission or the Paul Simon Commission, was actually chaired by a man named James Perkins, but JNCL was formally incorporated as a nonprofit, as a 501c3. Because of changes in the tax laws, the National Council for Languages and International Studies was created as a 501c4, which is essentially a trade council and allows us to use more resources for advocacy. So the Joint National Committee works to develop policy recommendations, working with our 140 member organizations and partner organizations. And the National Council for Languages and International Studies is actually the umbrella under which we go to Capitol Hill to lobby. We go to the White House, to the executive branch agencies to lobby for those policy ideas. We have 140 member organizations, educational associations, including large ones such as the American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages, the American Translators Association, down to very small groups like the Plan for the Partnership for Language Advocacy in Nevada, 40 members strong. We have a number of companies, language companies, in pretty much every part of the language industry, groups like Language Line Services, Language Testing International, large companies down to very small companies and startup companies in language, and then a small number of research institutes. Some of you may be familiar with Kent State University or the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey. And about myself, I'm America's language lobbyist. As Don noted, there are thousands of lobbyists in California. There are probably 10 times that number or 20 times that number in DC. But that's spread over every imaginable part of the country, every imaginable bit of the economy, and every imaginable special interest. So sometimes it's a bit lonely because there are a couple of people who lobby humanities issues or lobby, say, healthcare access issues, a slightly larger group. But there are only a small number of us working on language in Washington, D.C. I started my career in language in 1989 as a freelance Russian-English, English-Russian interpreter and translator, working during the era of perestroika and glasnost on joint Soviet NASA space projects, and did that for a number of years before wandering into academia and eventually into a career in language and national security and then the private sector, and now for the last 5 years at JNCL NCLIS, as we like to call it. Just want to credential myself a little bit because I know there are a lot of folks on the call who might not have any idea why you're listening to yet another disembodied voice on a webinar talking about things far, far away. So language access, and I do apologize. Some of this will be in the nature of review, but it's actually very important. Executive Order 13166, which was signed by President Clinton on August 24th, 2000, interprets the national origin clause of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act as extending to limited English proficiency. This is a foundational piece of language access for all sorts of social services. What it says is that any recipient of federal funding, no matter how far removed, must provide language access to those who are limited English proficient. That's the fundamental issue. And there are more detailed issues, more detailed requirements that every federal agency must have a language access plan, that any recipient of federal funding that has more than a certain percentage, I believe 5% of LEP population speaking a specific language, must have its essential documents in that language. And that's very, revolutionary for language access in the United States. It also required that the recipient of federal funds provide that language access at its own cost, and that's a very important point. Informal discussions around the time of its development and subsequent discussions with the people in the Department of Justice who were largely responsible for drafting this indicated this was a very smart move by the Clinton administration to do two things. Number one, it forestalled a significant set of case law that was winding its way through to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think the case was Gonzalez versus Alabama or Alabama versus Gonzalez, that had to do with language access at a motor vehicle administration in Alabama, but that was fairly clear that the plaintiff was going to win, that the state of Alabama had unjustly discriminated against this individual by not providing driver's license examinations in the target language, and language being Spanish, that there were exams provided in German for executives of Mercedes-Benz, which was then setting up factories and things like that, and that looking at the case law, that it was quite likely that this would be a mandate passed on to the federal government. So, as Don said, sometimes things look stacked, and sometimes the simplest explanation is the one that actually works. But in any case, the Executive Order 13166 mandated that the provider of the service at its cost provide for language access. It's been modified a bit in the Affordable Care Act, which I'll get to in a minute. At the federal level, LEP.gov, which is a vitally important resource because, as I said, every federal agency is required, among other things, to have a language access plan, and then to ensure that its grantees and its regional offices of civil rights are informed of that plan, and then they in turn have their own access plans. That is overseen at the federal level by the United States Department of Justice, the Office of Federal Compliance, which is a subsidiary unit of the Office of Civil Rights. And LEP.gov is a fantastic resource for all sorts of information on individual cases brought through the offices of civil rights, regional offices or national offices of civil rights of various agencies, on settlement decrees, as well as on best practices, things like the new procurement guide that was developed by the procurement subcommittee that is meant to assist federal agencies in purchasing language services. So highly recommend that as a resource. And then we come to the Affordable Care Act, and in particular, Section 1557, which is a vitally important advancement in language access for healthcare. That it requires the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to promulgate regulations on non-discrimination. The final rule was published last year, 45 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 92.201, which defines the requirements for the provision of language access. And I put that shortened URL in there for folks to look at it. And this is quite broad because what it does is it mandates that all healthcare providers receiving any federal funds provide meaningful access to those who don't speak English, whether or not they are providing that care under Medicare, Medicaid, or under the Affordable Care Act. And so that's quite broad. Now I'm going to circle back to the Affordable Care Act towards the end of the presentation, but do hold it in mind. One of the other changes made in the passage of the Affordable Care Act is that states can now apply for partial reimbursement of healthcare interpreting under Medicare and Medicaid. And to date, I believe 18 states have done so, though I don't we haven't been able to find a comprehensive list of those 18 states. And that helps alleviate the burden on of compliance on healthcare systems. So that's another focus potentially for state level advocacy, is if you're in a state that has yet to take that up, that might be something very much worth considering. We go to directions and language access. So there was an election, you may recall that, on November 8th, and the outcome was surprising to a great many of us, whatever your political orientation may be. I'm not presuming on the politics of the audience. But nevertheless, there was an election that signaled potentially fundamental and seismic shifts in all sorts of areas of policy in the United States. And right after the election, and indeed ever since, one of probably the most important question I've been asked is, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us in terms of the language industry, in terms of interpreting, in terms of language access, in terms of language education? So I immediately sought out smarter friends. I'm very lucky to have made the acquaintance of and worked with a bunch of really smart people over the years. Some of you are on the call and know who you are. So what would happen? So we have Executive Order 13166. Executive orders have this interesting place in federal law. They aren't actually laws. They have to be based in one or another set of laws. They aren't actually the laws themselves, although they do carry the force of law to some degree. But they are signed by the president at the discretion of the president. So it is theoretically possible that President Trump could, with a stroke of a pen, eliminate Executive Order 13166. However, I want to walk through this carefully. There have been multiple attempts in the House of Representatives, starting in 2001, to repeal Executive Order 13166. Congress does have that power to reject an executive order. It does take a majority vote in both houses. Most recently in 2011. There have never been more than 51 sponsors. These have been led by people like Peter King from New York, who was a noted proponent of English only, and Representative Istuk from Oklahoma, among others. Never more than 51 sponsors, and most recently in 2011. And that I think is telling in and of itself, because there are parts of the Republican Party that remember what happened in California after the middle part of the 90s, where a number of very clearly unfriendly bills passed, unfriendly towards immigrants, unfriendly towards minorities, unfriendly towards speakers of languages other than English. And Pete Wilson found himself out of office, and in fact California has had a supermajority Democratic legislature pretty much ever since. And with the exception, I think, of the Senate, and Don would know this, that the Senate took a while to create a supermajority in the California Senate. So the cooler heads in the Republican Party understand that politically, taking on language access and being seen as that hostile to minority rights might not work in the long run for the Republican Party. But more fundamentally, a lot of people oppose changes to Executive Order 13166 for principled reasons. It's founded in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which in turn rests on the Constitution, on the Interstate Commerce Clause in Article 1, and the 14th and 15th Amendments, among others. Those aren't going anywhere. And the challenge to the federal government that if it were to remove Executive Order 13166 is that, number one, for healthcare interpreting, Section 1557 is still on the books, and the rules promulgated under Section 1557 are still on the books. And then number two, it would open the federal government, would open the courts back up to suits over violations of the Civil Rights Act, with a very clear body of case law decided by some very conservative circuits of the U.S. Courts of Appeals that would put the federal government, in fact, in jeopardy, at some jeopardy of ending up in the position of having to pay for everything down the road. But that would also create a great deal of chaos. So I think cooler heads there may yet prevail. Now, the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557, you may have been paying attention to social media, mass media, CNN, however you consume the news of late. And as I said, there was an election and an attempt to overturn and replace the Affordable Care Act. That is stalled in the Senate. There are technical issues there that the Republican majority would need 51 votes to change anything that has to do with funding, federal funding, taxes, and payments from the federal treasury with respect to the Affordable Care Act. The regulatory provisions right now require 60 votes, and there's exceedingly unlikely that that any regulatory changes with the Affordable Care Act will be taken up by the Senate. They're just not going to get to 60 votes. So it's highly unlikely that Section 1557 would be eliminated, even if the Affordable Care Act is replaced in whatever form. Now, I often say that, tell my audiences that anybody who comes from Washington and tells you they know what's going on is lying and crazy. So I have to put a very significant caveat into pretty much everything I'm saying, that we have seen incredible chaos and disruption, not just since the election, but in the previous administration and the relationships between and among the houses of Congress and the White House and the two parties. So vigilance will still be required, and that's part of what our job is here at the Joint National Committee for Languages, staying in very close touch with the National Health Law Project, with key immigration law advocates, and with key players on Capitol Hill with respect to language access. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. That gives an overview on the political climate, which I know is unsettling, and I think for anyone who is familiar with this, the intellectual and political history of language access, these are unsettling times. But that being said, and we have to face that. We have to face those fears. But that being said, I think it's really important to remember there are significant structural and institutional reasons to say, well, for the moment, we can take a deep breath and be cautiously optimistic and be prepared. And at the same time, it's probably a good idea to keep our powder dry. I don't think we would want to necessarily point out to the administration that they have a language access executive order on the books. They're awfully distracted right now. Again, I keep referring to the news. The administration is very distracted right now. They're tremendously understaffed, so it's not likely they would take this up anyway. But for the moment, our approach is going to be just keeping our powder dry and staying alert and staying in touch with our key supporters on the Hill. And I'm going to shift now to the larger context. In the fall of 2014, a bipartisan group of senators and representatives wrote letters to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences asserting that English is no longer sufficient as a lingua franca, neither at home or abroad. The percentage of the world's population that speaks English as a first language is declining rapidly. If current demographic trends continue, only 5% of the world will be native English speakers by 2050. At the same time, the ability to communicate in languages other than English has never been more important, as American jobs and exports are more dependent than ever on foreign markets. The American population is increasingly multilingual. Americans are more engaged diplomatically and militarily around the globe than ever before, whether we all have our opinions on that. And challenges like poverty and disease and opportunities in scientific research and technological innovation all require greater international understanding and cooperation. I want to come back to the first sentence of this letter, and the link to this report and the letters to the Academy are contained, should be at the end of the slides, and if it's not, it will be at the version that I sent to Natasha later on. Congress asserts that English is no longer sufficient as a lingua franca, and then gives reasons why that is the case, and then asks the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to examine the following questions. How does language learning influence economic growth, cultural diplomacy, the productivity of future generations, and the fulfillment of all Americans? What actions should the nation take to ensure excellence in all languages? So this didn't happen in a vacuum. The effort to get those letters sent to the Academy consumed a year's worth of work. There was significant work with the Academy to determine that they would be, in fact, receptive to such a letter and would, in fact, carry out a project if a letter were to arrive. But in the end it did. And after about 18 months of work, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences issued this report that you have on the screen here, America's Languages, Investing in Language Education for the 21st Century, on February 28th. The title is actually really important because prior efforts around this, first off, let me backtrack slightly. This is the first national commission requested by Congress, the first major commission since 1978-79, and that's a long time ago, right? The Cold War is over, the internet is here, international airfare costs half of what it did or a third of what it did, 35, 40 years ago and so on. The world is a very different place. We are demographically more diverse, linguistically more diverse than perhaps at any time in our history. So it was an appropriate moment to have a report from a commission. America's Languages reflects that the commission wanted to address all of the languages found in the United States, the Native American, Alaska Native Hawaiian languages, the colonial languages, as it were, the heritage languages found in the U.S., and that the fact that we have this incredible linguistic diversity as a nation of immigrants with upward of 350 or 400 languages spoken, depending on which data source you look at. The report, there were actually a total of 7 reports issued by the commission. The report itself, the main report, America's Languages, a data report, the state of languages in the United States, which covers the major data sources on the numbers of languages spoken and where and what languages are taught and at what levels and so on. And then briefing papers. The commission commissioned, I love saying that, I never get tired of saying that, the commission commissioned 5 briefing papers. America's Languages, Challenges and Promise, the Contribution of Language to the Economic Interests of the United States, paper on foreign language, cultural diplomacy, and global security, Language and Productivity for All Americans from the Center for Language Science at Penn State, and Language Preservation and Language Access. You'll notice that these very closely mirror the structure of the letter and the questions that I read. So how does language matter to job growth, to national security, to the cognitive and educational fulfillment of our children, and then to social justice, language preservation, and language access. I encourage everyone to peruse these at the link here. There have been some 75,000 downloads from that site over the last 2.5 months, which is very encouraging for what is a fairly abstruse subject. But I want to move next to talk about what is probably the most germane of the briefing papers for this audience. And again, these were provided to the commission and are part of our collective effort at JNCL NCLIS of educating folks on the Hill and among our partners in Washington, D.C. 65 million Americans speak a language other than English home, according to the 2014 American Community Survey. It's a staggering number. That's the population essentially of Germany or the UK. We know we don't have enough programs for heritage language speakers to maintain their home languages. We know that English language learner programs, which are required by federal law, as well as civil rights case law, are also insufficient for the demand. And that, of course, we talked about the civil rights regulations that ensure access to social services to those who don't speak English. The challenges there at the highest level, we know that capacity has not grown as fast as the demand, especially in languages of lesser diffusion. If memory serves, the number of languages in which one can be certified, whether as a medical interpreter, a court interpreter, or even a translator at ATA, the number of language pairs is around 20. And the language marketplace in the United States extends well into 200 or more languages, although a great many of them are quite small. It's not a small language if you show up at Holy Cross Hospital in Silver Spring speaking it and not speaking English. And then discrimination does persist, and we continue to hear of cases, not necessarily systematic in the workforce and sometimes in healthcare. So what do you need to do? I say this to every audience when I do an advocacy seminar. Do your job well. The best advocacy for languages is a reputation for excellence and passion in what we do. That is fundamental, whether you're in a classroom, a doctor's office, a courtroom, that if we do our jobs well, then that reflects well on us, it reflects well on our peers, and it is the first and most important way of convincing our stakeholders, be they patients or healthcare professionals or students or parents, whatever that is, that we are good at what we do and deserving of their time and resources. And of course, continuing education, which is part of why 464 people are on this this webinar, that continuing education, staying sharp, and keeping up on your profession is very important. And get involved. NCICH, ATA, NAGIT, state associations, the IMIA, local chapters, there are lots of different ways of getting involved in professional networks. And I think that does a couple of things. It's again, preaching to the choir here. But if it's easy in language to end up feeling isolated, especially if you're not in a major metropolitan area, or if the language that you work in is not one of the major languages found in the United States. But even so, that professional network is vitally important. And then get others involved. And this is where I'm preaching to the choir. Most of our membership organizations reach about 15% of the potential members. It's the ones I'm concerned about are the ones who aren't on the webinars, who are not part of NCICH, who are not certified. Stay informed. We have a mailing list. We have news briefs, action alerts at the national level. You can sign up at languagepolicy.org. I know that CCHI also has regular information. CHIA has regular information, and so on. So make sure that you get those action alerts and the weekly news briefs and so on. You can skim them, you can delete them as if you don't have the time, but at least make sure you're getting them. If you do get an action alert, these come from us and from a number of other organizations. It's really very easy the action alert is very specific. It asks you to write or call your legislators. You click on a link and you can send an email with a preformed letter. You put in your coordinates, figures out who your senators and representatives are, and then you click send. You can always tweak the letter or rewrite it to suit, to personalize it and so on. And I always tell folks, make sure you do this from your personal email, not your work email, but please do sign up for our action alerts. It's very easy to do on our splash page. And then responding to those alerts. I will say that congressional offices tend to see language issues as a coherent whole. So whenever there's an action alert on something related to language, it's really important to respond, because what that does is it reinforces the overall impression on the Hill that this is an important and very complex area of endeavor and deserving of their attention. So with that, I'll turn it back to Margarita and settle in for some question and answer.
Thank you so much for your excellent, informative presentation. And I think the last point is really important. If we don't do it for ourselves, no one will. And we need to have authority of sorts. When we represent ourselves as certified interpreters, it's very different than we speak just as private citizens. So I know that many of you on the webinar today are certified. If you are still thinking about it, jump in. If you have friends who are thinking about becoming certified but have not yet, talk to them. Highlight that aspect of self-advocacy for healthcare interpreters, that when we are certified, that when we are active, when we attend conferences, when we talk to other people, we can change things. That old adage of there is power in numbers, it is completely true, and even more so today than ever. And now we're opening our questions and answers period. And I think my question is to Dr. Rivers. Am I correct that it seems like right now it's perhaps not the best time for a sort of active role on a federal level? That's the best strategy right now, is to wait and see what is happening on the federal level with potential English only laws and language access in general?
I think waiting and seeing is very important. As I said, we are very quietly sussing out what's going on. We've heard nothing about any introduction of an English-only act. I mean, there is, I think one was introduced, and it got absolutely no press. This has done every session on making English the national language. It would, unless a congressional amendment were offered, and then that requires a tremendous level of effort to get a congressional amendment through. Any such law would be symbolic. For the most part, the states and municipalities that have passed such laws, they have no teeth because, again, federal civil rights laws and the U.S. Constitution take precedence. I think Arizona might be the one exception, but and forgive me if I'm not up to speed on that. And in a great many places, especially at the local, municipal or county level, these English-only ordinances are often stricken very quickly because they are seen by local business communities as actually signaling something unfriendly about the locality. But that being said, I would say that stay vigilant and be ready to respond. But at this point, I'm not all that concerned about having to fight something like that, like an English only or an overturn of language access at the federal level.
Thank you.
I think where we are going to move forward is trying to press more with LEP.gov, with the General Services Administration for a better definition of interpreter qualification. And I think that's actually both more manageable and more important at the moment.
Thank you, Bill. It's actually reassuring to hear something like this. I believe we have a couple more questions.
Yes, let me read the first one, and either of you can take it, but it was written when Don was speaking. So, when preparing to testify or meet with legislators, do you suggest having a one-page handout with points that you want to make in brief bulleted statements, to bring something and give it something?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is it's not more complicated than that. That is, you are always going to need some sort of material that you can leave behind, and for just logistical purposes, such documents get passed hand to hand within legislative offices on some level, unless there's some material, unless there's some artifact left behind. In a very real sense, it didn't happen. So yes.
Yeah, I'd follow up with saying that one page, get your issue on one page, no footnotes, 10th grade reading level, and you'll find that's actually a very difficult exercise to put a complex issue, boil it down to something that a very busy person can read it and say, aha, I want to know more. And then make sure as part of your follow-up, you can take that paper into the office. As part of your follow-up, you email them the PDF, so that makes it much more shareable and much more persistent. It doesn't get buried in a stack of papers, so they can actually move it around pretty quickly.
Thank you. Another question is, before approaching the political powers, how do you find others who have similar interests or legislative goals as yourselves? Do you have strategies for finding those like minds? And I know, Bill, you shared the information of many associations that you deal with, so we definitely can refer to your website, but any other suggestions on how do you start searching for people who you have the passion for language access and for interpreting at state or local or federal level?
I'll start. Maybe Don can chime into it. At the state level, at the federal level, certainly groups like the National Association of Judicial Interpreters and Translators, which is a JNCL NCLIS member, and they also do their own advocacy day, have very coherent and interests in language access. And then looking at, it's a little harder sometimes to get the stakeholders involved, especially healthcare systems where there's kind of there's something of a labor management relationship, but looking at other obvious places and groups like La Raza and LULAC and other immigrant advocacy organizations are also very much invested in language access.
I would like to say, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don.
The only thing I would add to that is you already know, you may not know who they are exactly, but I guarantee that you already know people, regardless of how little you think your circle travels to in overlaps with policy-making circles. You already know people who could direct you toward likely candidates. Within California, I'd like to think that a lot of you on this webinar could contact me, and I could, if that's your question, I could probably give you, 6 or 8 good places to start.
I would like to add is don't underestimate power of social media. If you just search for interpreter groups on Facebook, you will find amazing number of official and unofficial groups of various stakeholders. State associations have Facebook groups. People who interpret in various languages form their own groups. And you, honestly, like Don said, never know what are the 6 degrees of separation. So find those groups, join them on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and use the power of social media for good. If you have an important cause, spread the word on social media and do it in the targeted ways. So join various groups, like various pages, create your own group on Facebook and invite people to join you. Post updates on LinkedIn. It is not very difficult to do, and it can be very productive. In my own sort of local case study, I joined Local Next Door, and I found other people who had the same concerns I did, and they emailed our local government body. So when I came to present, I could say I'm not the only one. There are other people who have the same concerns. So harness social media for good. It's not just for cat pictures anymore.
And the last question, I know we have more questions, but I wanted to ask one last question, and then the rest we will address in providing the resources on our website when we publish this recorded webinar and the PowerPoint. But the question is the following. When professionals such as us, interpreters, lobby for their own self-interests, the message is logically received with suspicion. The most powerful voices are often those that are most impacted. Do you suggest we engage consumers or stakeholders in our lobbying efforts? And if so, how do you frame the discussions away from interpreters towards better services for patients, consumers? And do any of the current lobbying organizations or organizations engaging in advocacy collect horror stories from consumers, and can we contribute to them? It's a big question, but it touches on so many aspects. So if maybe Bill, you start, and then Don, you add.
Sure. So yes, if we are seen as self-interested, but that's okay. Right, it's expected that people will come in and present their own interests to the seats of power. I mean, we're exercising our First Amendment rights to petition the government for redress. That being said, having external validation can be very powerful, because it's not that we're having other people making the case for us. It's they're saying, yes, that actually matters, and we do agree. It's not necessarily that, say, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to lobby actively on behalf of the language industry or on behalf of language access, but they will say, oh yeah, that makes sense, and in fact our members broadly understand this and agree with it, to use that as an example. So in point of fact, getting those other stakeholders involved is really important, but first and foremost it has to come from us. If we don't do it, they're not going to do it for us.
Thank you.
I would agree. That is, you present yourself as in a sense, a special interest. I would like to think in the best sense of the word or the term, and you're expected to lobby on behalf of your profession. That said, the language you use will over time almost become second nature. that you will be presenting your arguments in a way where first and foremost in your mind it's the well-being of patients and LEP residents that is kind of should be the driving impulse and motivation for the legislator to act on something, rather than ensuring that a particular profession is sustainable and ongoing. Now that said, there are plenty of arguments to make that you have to set up the game board correctly in order to ensure that there's a proper, well-motivated, well-incentivized healthcare interpreting workforce available, or you will not be able to accomplish these other goals. But I think that the ears of most legislators have been tuned to think first about what are the interests of the recipients of the benefits of the particular program. So if you use the language of the patient in the course of lobbying for yourself, I think that's the goal.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And if I would like to give each one of our guests today, half a minute for the closing remarks, or shorter, and then I will go over the logistics of how you get your certificates and give the attendance code for this webinar. So, Margarita.
Well, I have very simple closing remarks. I want to thank Don Schinske and Bill Rivers for participating. As a chair of CCHI, I'm very honored and very touched that you found time for us. I appreciate how busy you both are, and thank you for sharing your words of wisdom with us. I think this webinar will be downloaded many times, and it was really informative and very practical and very passionate. So thank you on behalf of CCHI and all of our CHIs who joined us today during the webinar.
Thank you both, and thank you everyone for attending. For those of you in California, if you want to know about any particular piece of legislation or things that should be addressed, feel free to contact CHIA as a resource. Feel free to contact me. Like a lot of lobbyists and maybe a lot of interpreters, sometimes we pretend we don't have a lot of time to talk about things, but once you get us started, we don't shut up. So happy to talk.
I'd like to thank Natalia and Margarita and Don as well, and thank CCHI for inviting me to present. And I just ask that everyone stay informed and stay engaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so the final logistics, just to remind us what I said in the beginning, we will email you a web link to a CCHI webpage, which will have the PDF of the slides that our guests shared with us graciously. It will not be an attachment. And on the same webpage, there will be additional resources, including answers to some of the questions which we didn't have the time to cover today. We also will have the materials listed separately that are both Don and Bill mentioned today. The recording of this webinar will be available free of charge to anyone because we think it's a very important topic for our profession. It will be available on our website, as well as for those of you who have friends who missed today's live presentation. It will be available as an online training module at our training website, which is cchiinterpreters.org. But as far as the certificate, for those of you who attended today, it will be emailed to you by June 6th, and the body of the message will be the certificate itself. It will not come as an attachment. So if you had more than one person listening to this webinar with one login, in other words, you have colleagues sharing this webinar in the same room, please write down the attendance code 8X5C71, and I will repeat 8, letter X, 5, letter C, 7, 1. And the last time, 8X5C71. With that, I would like